Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We hope that you've had a great morning/afternoon of activities here at day 2 of the NISTS conference. I know for me, I have gained a tremendous amount of insight listening to our award winners this morning, had an opportunity to then sit next to those folks in the hot seat who were coached by our experts, and our sessions that have been taking place have been so interesting as well. And I just know this next session that we're bringing to you will be just in line with everything that you've come to expect from this conference. As a quick reminder, the next session, if you by chance need to toggle on or off the live transcript screen, is available to you. Just look at the closed caption at the bottom of your screen. And then also there will be Q&A involved in this particular session. Know that we may not be able to answer all questions, but we will do the very best that we can. You could submit those online, and our panelists and myself will be going through those to get to just as many as we can. So without further ado, let's just talk a little bit about where the genesis was for this session. And as we all know, we are all struggling to understand how we can best dismantle systemic racism in our society. We are grappling with what is the best way to do that within higher education. How can we as professionals no longer accept the status quo? How can we get in there and do things differently? We've all committed to this work. We've been doing our individual work. We've been doing some collective work on our campuses and within our organizations. And we're here just to understand some really important direction on how we can do this best as folks who are inundated with lots of information. Our hearts are in the right place. Our heads are getting there. We're just wanting to understand it on a deeper level. And so our thoughts are, as transfer agents, you all have the opportunity, the expectation, and the wherewithal to make change, no matter where you stand within your institution, no matter what your functional area is, and no matter where it is that you fall in the administrative order of your institution or your organization. And we want to empower to feel that change and to know that change. And today is all about understanding yourself, understanding your students, understanding your institutional context, such that you can be the best transfer agent you can, that we can bring culturally responsive practices to our students, environments that make them feel like they have a sense of belonging, and in reminding them that they are where they need to be because we're there with them. I am joined by a distinguished panel of guests today that I'm excited for you to hear from. They will be introducing themselves as they present. They've got some words that they'll be sharing with you initially independently, and then collectively we're going to be spending time just in conversation about moving this topic to the forefront of our minds and the work that we're doing on behalf of our transfer students. So I would love to turn the panel over at this point. We've got Dr. Ebony Zamani Gallagher, and Ebony, please begin.
Sure thing. Thanks so much for the invitation. Happy to have this opportunity to spend some time with you all, and particularly colleagues that are sharing a panel. I want to be able to talk a little bit about with this panel, some of the charge that was given to us by Janet. And so in lieu of how this was conceptualized, we really thought about how we enter a space and a place to do equity work is really contingent upon different layers, if you will, of awareness that is multi-tiered, multifaceted, and it's nuanced. And so that there are aspects with which, as we think about ourselves as community college advocates, as transfer champions, that we can indeed hold ourselves accountable for being much more transfer inclusive in terms of being equity focused and centered and conscious, and in ways that are not color elusive or race neutral. And so as we thought about that, we also thought that, you know, we need to take heed to the fact that within our institutions, there's some work that has to be done. And I think some of that work in terms of OCCRL, where I'm at the University of Illinois, where I direct our Office for Community College Research and Leadership, again, really tries to explore and help folks as they think about the nuances as to what we need to do. And so we endeavor to help, from a P20 perspective, though we're community college centered, we're not community college solely, but to help individuals to break out of the silos of what we see in the way of the work that's happening, to think about the extent to which we can move diverse youth and adults in, through, and out of post-secondary, namely community colleges, but keeping in mind, again, further education, as well as how folks move on to gainful employment. And so we look at kind of our 4 buckets or pillars, if you will, for how we go about doing that. And a through line of that is, again, understanding issues of salience relative to intersectionality and identities of who we serve and who we are in terms of how we are looking to help students to self-actualize, and whether we're faculty, staff, administrative leaders, the various stakeholders, how we can create transfer momentum that creates, the climates for excelling, for matriculation, for equitable experiences and outcomes for students. Some of the work that we've done, and this is not the kind of exhaustive things of list of what we're doing right now, but within our portfolio, again, what is centered and what we're unapologetic about is doing equity-centered work. And when I say equity-centered work at LCCRL, we really kind of talk about it as how do we build folks' equity consciousness? And I'm getting to a little bit later about how we have a consciousness gap as it relates to how we move students in, through, and out of, like those transition points and transfer pathways, and how we can make that more equitable. But again, we are really about advocating and advancing research, evaluation, professional development, technical assistance, and public engagement relative to how we can advance students, all students, but also not with a broad stroke of an all lives matter approach or a rising tide lifts all our boats. We do believe that as we talk about equity consciousness, that it is not siloed from race equity and racial justice, and that we have, again, in this multi-layered perspective, responsibilities with the self, as well as thinking about who our students are and the institutional organizational responsibilities that help us to chip away and get at more of the structural and systemic barriers. Just want to spend a little brief time, touching on why this is critical for us to have the conversation. Again, when we think about pathways to completion, many states have what is a 60 by 2025. The Lumina Foundation has really been in front of that charge of wanting to say that we can't get there without community colleges, that they are core. And so as we look at the credentialing pathways, whether it's incremental credentials and stackable, or as transfer in the way of concurrent enrollments for high school students with accelerated pathways, reverse transfer, or what is, again, the more traditional vertical and lateral transfer, we have to unpack that, right? That there's more to a data story than having equity mindedness be just about the disaggregation of data alone. But when we do unpack that data and do it in a nuanced, granular fashion to look at what's happening by race and ethnicity and by gender, we see patterns that have prevailed whereby, again, white collegians, in contrast to their counterparts, are faring better with degree conferrals. And then we also see that play out with transfer rates. You can see with this slide that there's greater likelihood of transfer and larger shares of white and Asian students that move from 2-year to 4-year institutions. Now, as, again, transfer champions, folks that are about advancing racially equitable experiences and outcomes, we have to make sure that we're not having deficit lens. And so from a deficit lens, if you might look at this data and say, what's going on with those Black and brown students, right? Where it is, putting an onus on the students and saying that they're underperforming and they're not cutting it, or they're not making it, or there's achievement gaps, versus an asset-based approach and not a deficit-laden lens would suggest that we push back on that and say, how is it that we're underserving the student, as opposed to blaming the student for these results in terms of equity consciousness that's also, again, very nuanced relative to being able to face race. Because, you know, my colleagues and I have been doing this work long enough where each of us, you know, just in some of our pre-meetings about this panel, have talked about how folks will tell us they have a commitment to diversity, and at the same time want to ensure equity, but also can't face race. And so we have to face race. So when you look at this data here, and again, thinking through that there's generally a correlation around, you know, further education, again, transfer being an ideal vehicle for that mobility and advancement educationally, economically, socially. But we do see that for those students that are making that move from 2-year to 4-year, again, much more robust with white students and Asian students, and not as much of a share from racially minoritized students that are Native American, Black, and Latinx. We also see that there's persistent joblessness, so that race is not you know, mitigating anything with regard to enrollment and matriculation, transfer, and successful completion, that irrespective of educational attainment in terms of its highest level across levels, that there's still a persistent employment and unemployment and joblessness. And so right now, as we battle parallel pandemics of race and health and the economy and the climate and leadership, we see that there is even a heightened sense of disparate treatment and results and outcomes for racialized minorities students. So again, in terms of this consciousness gap, and as I, you know, kind of move to segue, you know, to Francesca, we want you to think through that there is a really time, this is the time for us to meet the moment. We don't want to miss the moment. But we also don't want to reduce this to just a moment, because as we've talked about reconciling what's happening with race, the reckoning with race amid a global health crisis, we also know that this pandemic relative to COVID, well, you know, racism has predated it, right? Racism is a pandemic. And so we do see where there's a need to build the awareness, understanding of our own implicit biases, understanding of the roles that we all play to illuminate where the inequities are. And many times they are racialized inequities within our transfer pathways. So in being critically reflective practitioners, and in terms of thinking about, again, this conceptualization of moving from inward outward, from self in terms of the individual, and then to our interpersonal and with our students, to institutional responsibilities. We just, again, I'm putting this in front of you to think about that this isn't a one and done, this isn't a checklist, but this is iterative, this is ongoing work. And so the movie, like, you know, what is it called? Are we there yet with Ice Cube? Yeah, no, we're not there yet. We haven't been there, and we still got a long way to go to get there. But much of it, you have to start with self and build out. And so checking your own attitudes, your own biases, understanding what you're aware of. Many times our folks have higher levels of self-efficacy as it comes to, you know, multicultural efficacy than they actually do have. So again, think about where you are with that. Think about institutionally in terms of your organization. You could think about this from a program area, a unit area, to more broadly across campus. Then also think about in terms of how systems are designed, right? And that they basically produce the results for which they were designed. And in many cases, as we think about folk of color within transfer pathways, and even, you know, the intersecting of the identities as we think about the transfer experience, that sometimes that is underattended. and that there's an institutional responsibility and a personal responsibility as educators that we need to more sharply be attuned to and work with. All right, so then lastly, you know, I've talked about the interpersonal, and I don't want to take too much time so that Francesca can move us into a conversation around how to understand our students better in terms of the impact of transfer on their experiences. But again, all of us would implore you to, you know, to move forward in your equity journey, because it is a journey. Again, it's not a one and done, that we want for individuals and institutions to get beyond the general statements, if you will, to not be satisfied with statements about commitment, but to actually commit to change by making action steps and not defaulting to what has been status quo as it relates to that. Here's some information for me, and I look forward to us having some additional conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Ebony. I appreciate you laying that groundwork and ensuring that we are challenging ourselves to look within, and also situating that within the context of looking out. I love the fact that we're not being color elusive and that we're not being race neutral. We're really calling it what it is, and that we need to be really mindful that we are needing to change our consciousness around race and being more forthright in that. So we'll circle back around and talk a little bit more about those things. But Francesca, please step up and tell us a little bit about yourself and bring us to that student conversation.
So thank you very much. So my name is Francesca Carpenter, and I am the Director of Equity Initiatives at Achieving the Dream. But first, I want to start by making a land acknowledgement. I know some of you all are familiar with those, and for some who aren't, a land acknowledgement is a statement that formally recognizes the historical and continuing connection between Indigenous peoples and their native lands. So in this spirit, I humbly make this land acknowledgement. I am joining you from the ancestral and unceded land of the Piscataway peoples. I humbly offer my respect to the elders, past and present citizens of the Piscataway Conoy tribe. Now, while a land acknowledgement is not enough, right, it is important in the social justice conversation and in our conversation about decolonizing the practice that promotes Indigenous invisibility. Okay, so let's start. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the students, right? And then your role, and then how you can support students during transfer. So I'm coming to you from Achieving the Dream, and Achieving the Dream is a national nonprofit leader, and we champion evidence-based institutional improvement. We have member colleges throughout the country. I won't get into that. There are about 280 some colleges across the country. So this image right here is of our 2019 Dream Scholars, and they're standing at the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C. This was last February, pre-COVID. And so each student pictured here has an intersecting identity and experience. So we heard a little bit about intersecting identities. Their stories and experiences are what add to their richness and the tangible reason that they're on this educational journey. And so as critically conscious practitioners, as transfer practitioners, as transfer champions, and equity-minded practitioners, it's important that you remember that they are the why. They are your why. Their success is the why. Their economic mobility is the why. And the betterment of their communities and our communities is the why. So a little bit more about the why. So we know that students bring their full selves with them whenever they step on campus. And that means they are not a single story, right? What you see visually is not all that a student brings. There's been a shift in the field, as some of you all know, from focusing more on students needing to be ready for college to institutions needing to be student ready. And as your role, you have a huge part in that as they matriculate to and through and transfer. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about knowing your students. So what does it mean to know your students? Getting to know your students at a minimum is just that basic demographic data that we saw a little bit ago, right? Just that flat data and a little bit about them. But I'm going to implore you to dig deeper into your students' stories to learn more about them, who they are, and how to support them better. Why are they even at your college? Why are they interested in transfer? Talk about their prior educational experiences with them, right? What have your students done before they came to you? Are they first generation students? Do they have support from their family or friends or community? Have they felt empowered to actualize their own agency? And then talk about the responsibilities. What type of responsibilities do they have? We know that the majority of community college students are part-time students, and a lot of them have jobs and families, right? So what do they have to account for in showing up? Childcare, elder care, jobs, that type of thing. So what is their main motivation to transfer? Why? What's in it for them, right? What do they see as their educational path and their career trajectory? So as we learn more about students, it helps us better understand how to support them on their journey. So this is a graphic that we show a lot inside our organization. And we know from our work with colleges that a student's lived experience tells the story of how they show up. I mentioned that before. It impacts how well they are able to navigate the system of higher education that was not necessarily designed for them, depending on who the student is, obviously. So the above visual shows how when the right supports are put in place, a student is able to successfully complete or transfer. And I want you to keep in mind that there's a multi-layered experience that students go through when how they show up, right? And it can either help or hinder their progress. So we talked about COVID a little bit already, and we already know that there were some transfer interruptions, right? Some things happened during COVID that stopped students from moving the way that they anticipated. So there were interrupted plans, right? We know that some students' goals were put on hold. Family members may have been affected by the virus. Financial implications impacted the students' ability to continue or to transfer. We saw that a lot of students decided not to continue, right? And that means they did not transfer, obviously. There were pauses and dropouts. And we also know from the data that Black and Latinx students have been impacted the most by the virus and by the ability to transfer. So this quote here says that no evidence to date can dispute the pandemic's disproportionately large impacts on Black and Hispanic students, not only for the magnitude of their general enrollment losses, but also for losses in the number of students who transfer. So in contrast, we see that more Asian American students are transferring into public and nonprofit four-year institutions than they were pre-pandemic. And I saw that there was a question in the chat that we might get to about why is that the case? I have some hypotheses, but we'll see what we get to. So one thing that all humans need, a few basic tenets, is to be seen, to be heard, and to be affirmed. So being seen, what does that mean for your students? The intersecting identities. We know that about 30% of community college students are unbanked. What does that mean with the way they move around a campus? What systems or programs are in place to support them and prepare them for when they do transfer? So I said this before and I'll say it again. I encourage you not to stick with the single story narrative. So we know that every Black, Latinx, and Indigenous person does not have the same story, and one individual person does not speak or represent an entire race of people. So I implore you to check your assumptions at the door. Check them when you start to have conversations with these students, because you will. When you hear them, you're able to listen to their stories, hear their backgrounds, be able to match them with mentors that have interests that are aligned with theirs. And I ask you to be able to encourage your students, make them feel safe and comfortable so they will talk to you without fear of judgment or fear of punishment or any sort of perceived ridicule. So to be affirmed. So we all want to be supported, encouraged, right? And especially BIPOC students as they are trying to pursue their goals. I want to make sure that you do not, or you avoid tracking students into pathways or into institutions that will not allow them to reach their full potential. Last week, we had our national conference, and one of our students said that she wanted to go to NYU. And she was an immigrant student from El Salvador. And she was told with an accent that thick, you're not going, right? You can't make it. So I am asking you to help break up that, right? Encourage students' goals, listen to them. Next, creating visibility for our Indigenous people. In a lot of data sets, they're the small n, right? Some institutions, community colleges, and 4 years do not have a large population of Native American students. But I ask you to really look deeper at the ones that you do have or the ones that you do interact with. So invisibility really in essence is the modern form of racism that's used against Native Americans. We just don't see you. It's not that many of you. We don't really care about you. We're not counting you. And you can't participate. So Native American students cannot participate if they are not visible. So on the flip side, when Native people are seen, sometimes it's not always in a supportive light. So you will hear me say things that encourage you to treat students as people in a humane way, right? Next. So this is a persona that you can use or something similar to this in your conversations with your teams or your staff or your colleagues. Something like this is used at Amarillo College in Texas. They created a picture of a student, and this helps drive those hard conversations. We're not naming one particular student, but this student's profile is a compilation of a lot of different students, that they encounter at Amarillo. So this is a first generation college student. She's working 2 jobs. She has family responsibilities, and she attends school part-time. So that's something that you can think about doing when you're trying to figure out how to navigate supporting different students. Okay, so here's some recommendations for you. One, I would say, invest in the resources necessary to prioritize student transfer. The second thing I would say is provide tailored, customized advising, okay? Then help your students plan how they're gonna pay for when they go to the next institution, okay? Then make sure that your website and your materials are accurate and they're easy to understand. If that means creating content in different languages, do it. Help your students explore the career and transfer options, right? Don't just say, you said you want to do this, you're going to be stuck with this. Help them evolve as students. And also continuously monitor student progress, right? Providing them feedback on how they're doing and how things are moving along for them. So this next set of strategies are pretty easy to take hold of. The first one is to create a process map. And a process map of how a student experiences or navigates the transfer pathway. And then ask yourself, what did you learn from this? Think about inviting some students of color who left your institution to transfer, and ask them, how did you experience this process? What worked for you? What didn't work for you? How can we improve? Then institute this secret shopper sort of idea. You bring an external person in to walk through the way a student would, okay? They'll find those sticking points and those problem areas and bring them to your attention so that you can work on them. And then next, interview students who were on their way on this path and then stopped. What was it that had them stop? What were their struggles? And then figure out if there are some improvements that you can make to help that not be the case for them in the future and for other students. So next, we know that students need consistency and continuity in information. Don't change things up on them, right? Be clear with the information. They need approachable messaging and resources, like I said before, easy to read and understand content, and possibly in some native languages, to have their time respected. They don't want to get the runaround, okay? To have to tell their story one time, having to move from place to place to place to person to advisor, have them tell their story one time. They want to know who to be able to call, especially now during COVID, when a lot of them are not on campuses. Who can I reach out to when I need assistance, and how do I find that information? And they want to absolutely, like we all do, be treated as human beings. And they want you to be their advocate. So when students do transfer, there are some things that you also can think about, right? As students move through their first semester on the other end of transfer, ask some questions. This is a lot of questioning here, right? Have they stopped or dropped? What happened? Can that be mitigated in some way? Do they have support from their transfer agents or champions that they can identify with, like Estella mentioned yesterday, right? People that they can relate to. And are there opportunities for building peer relationships, something that you can sort of move through for them? So next, I'm coming to the end here. So next, things to keep in mind. I really want you to make sure that you talk about transfer early and often. I'm sure you know this, but don't leave this till the very end for students. Also, don't assume, this is not here, but don't assume that students know how and what they need to do to make the transfer process happen, okay? There's some misconceptions about transfer in the community, as you know. Establish a through process for students. I visualize this like a relay race. It's a smooth process for students. If you can, utilize and establish these partnerships. And if there are unwritten partnerships, let those be unofficial between a college and a four-year institution. Create opportunities for exposure for your students. Let them go on college tours, either in person or virtually. Tell them what is available to them. Maybe that will broaden their horizons. Validate the students' experiences, challenge your own biases, and know, as Ebony said, this equity work is never finished. So this is just one thing to keep in mind. So a student's experience is defined by many small, seemingly insignificant interactions, but the impact of one negative experience or a significantly negative experience can have a lasting impact on their lives. So I'm asking that you be the champions that stop negative experiences for your students. Thank you.
Francesca, I appreciate that very clear addressing of the students, ensuring that all of our students particularly are, whenever we're thinking about visibility, that really struck me as ensuring that, those voices are heard, and they can't be heard if they're not acknowledged in the very beginning. I appreciate having those very specific ideas on how to manage students through that transfer process. And I'd like to loop back around in just a little bit to talk more specifically about gathering student stories, how we can do that when so many of our institutions are not talking amongst themselves. Maybe departments aren't talking amongst themselves. How you can decrease the number of times students have to tell their stories, and how we can hopefully create a climate in which students can come in, feel comfortable, and know that when they've said it, it's been heard and they won't have to repeat it. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. Michael, welcome.
Well, certainly good to be with you today. And I think this is such a powerful, powerful conversation. What I know is that I wish I could be here in this kind of environment and setting. But I'm happy to be with you in this conversation today because, in fact, you find me in New York where it's cold and snowy. But the thing about New York is a good metaphor for this conversation because it seems like day turns into night so quickly. And in New York, you might imagine everybody is moving really fast, trying to get to the destination that they're on the train, they're moving, they're hustling. So many different places that they can go, so many things that they can do. But ultimately, we are trying to get somewhere special. And just like every student that comes to every campus across the country, trying to get somewhere special is extraordinarily important. But we can't do it alone. And when we are working together with our students, when we come together in meaningful ways, we ultimately can make a big difference. We can be stronger together without forgetting that we have powerful things that make us important individuals. And so today we're really thinking about this inclusion by design, a transfer inclusive climate. But two questions really ground this conversation. Why create a transfer inclusive institutional climate in the first place? And considering the need to develop, deliver on that institutional responsibility, what are the tasks that we need to do? Well, why this transfer inclusive climate? There's a couple of really important ways. Because it is important for us to address the legacy of shameful structural racism perpetuated through higher education opportunity caste systems. That we can elevate our various college missions, visions, and value statements, affirm the role of higher education in strengthening the nation, and also, equity focused reform catalyzes campus wide collaboration and commitment. So, there are a lot of really important reasons why we should engage in a transfer inclusive climate. But if you don't really understand the important social justice realities, here's something else. There's a reality that community college students represent an increasingly important student segment at many colleges and universities. That community colleges can be a source of students with high potential to succeed. Many even find that transfers require less financial aid than first-time freshmen. And of course, the data shows students who complete an associate degree before transferring have a greater likelihood of completing their baccalaureate degree than the average native first year freshman. So we have to understand that if there are social justice and economic reasons, particularly in the fact that right now this country is hitting a reset button, and if we don't work together, all institutions, whether you're a 4-year or 2-year institution, will have the really fallout from this challenging economic set of circumstances. Well, you certainly can't engage in a transfer inclusive climate if you don't wrestle with the fact that we have in this country histories, policies, and practices that became the law of the land that limited voting and housing and educational access and economic access. And because of that, we have these unequitable outcomes and racial disparities that showcase themselves in our economic and wealth gaps, our education gaps, our health gaps, our life expectancy. All of these gaps then feed the implicit bias, the unchallenged narratives, the priming, the associations, the assumptions. We assume because of the gaps that are based because of our history that people don't have the ability to be successful or they have to pull themselves up from their bootstraps. But if you don't pay attention to the history and the policies and the practices and the opportunity caste systems that have been established, then these narratives that go unchallenged, these narratives that are reified by the outcomes, really have to be addressed. And this is the time to do it more than any other. Understand this in a very practical way. There was a time where people thought it was okay to classify Aunt Jemima on a pancake box. And then we tried to be politically correct by changing the figure, the thinking that the imagery that we were actually reifying in the first place could be easily wiped away by changing the names on a box. That is not going to be enough. We have to understand that it's not just cosmetic. When we're talking about inclusion, when we're talking about moving in the place of equity as institutions, we have to recognize that it wasn't until laws were challenged that Black folks couldn't go to schools that were segregated, that actually taxpayer dollars were funding all these schools. And so this separate and unequal was the law of the land. These kinds of things still show up in the ways in which higher education is laid out, and we've got to address them. And so when we're talking about equity, what we're talking about is what Aspen talks about, this idea of equity in what for whom. Equity and access that the college proportionally enrolls students from every racial, ethnic, age, socioeconomic, and gender group relative to a community or service area. across all areas and programs, including in high wage, high demand fields. So it's not just you now can come here, but if you can't act, if you're in an academic program, a poor person comes into an academic program that leads them into poverty, you've built them a bridge to nowhere. Equity in learning, that the college ensures that differences in students' academic preparation levels, abilities, and cultural backgrounds do not limit access to high quality instruction and learning opportunities. And of course, equity in success, that there are no race or class-based disparities in completion and transfer rates and completion rates in high wage, high demand fields and programs of study. And so we've got to be very, very clear when we're talking about equity, what are we talking about? And every institution is different. But in fact, your context has to be your content, the work that you do. You have to have a sense of where your institution is in addressing a race, sort of race informed equity agenda. And most specifically, we find that some institutions have what we call these stages of competence. We have some that are what I would call unconsciously incompetent. They don't know that they don't know they need to know how to address race equity issues. You might find some people on your campus that are like that. When you're conscious but incompetent, you know that you don't know how to address race equity issues. When you're consciously competent, you know that you need to and that you have a plan to do it. And then, of course, when you're unconsciously competent, inclusive excellence is your norm, that you really have an approach to make sure that there is equity in and for all people. So, what does that actually look like? Well, it starts with some folks on the campus that are unconsciously incompetent in a state of denial. Why do we have to talk about these issues? Some are, I don't know how to talk about these issues, so maybe I shouldn't talk about these issues. Some will say, I don't think that we should be talking about these issues because you are going to create problems on the campus. We got enough problems in the world. Don't bring them on campus. And some are just, this is not my issue and I can't be bothered. Well, guess what? Those are the common reactions of people who oftentimes are ones that didn't have the issues, didn't go through the experience, didn't have any of the challenges that we are trying to get consciousness for students who experienced a difficult time in some of our institutions. Then some institutions are in this place of acceptance. We don't know how to address it, but we know something has to be done. And that is an important place to start. But you can't stop there because you got to get to this place when you become open and that you begin to test exactly how you're going to address some of the race equity issues. And once you get to this place of relearning, once you get to this place of integrating, how we're going to address equity reform at our campus, then you can actually make a meaningful difference. And so understand that this is a journey, and the journey takes time. But you have to be able to go on that journey with a direction, a destination. Like I showed you those trains and those maps in the subway. You have to have a focus forward. And so the other question I asked is, how can you start building a transfer inclusive climate? And that means you have to really consider how you're going to move this forward. And I'll just give you two things to think about. One is how you can address equity focused reform opportunities in the student experience. Think about the critical junctures of the student experience, the connection from the interest to the application. Where are you recruiting? How are you recruiting them? What does your recruitment materials look like? What languages are your recruitment materials in? What are the barriers that automatically make it difficult for people to successfully navigate your system? And what are the systems that are connected and the equitable consequences disaggregated by the data? In terms of the first year, from entry to passing gatekeeper courses, what does the first year experience look like for all students? And are you looking at how those systems either help or hinder students, wherever their background is, to move forward, but most specifically by race and ethnicity? The progress from program entry and completion to completion of program requirements. Are all students getting the same opportunities and the support at their level of preparation so that they can take advantage of continuing to move forward to that completion? Are we all having students that graduate and transfer and move forward in furthering their education and labor market advancement? But you can't just stop focusing on the students. because you also have employees at your institution you got to focus on. Just think about it. In the candidacy phase of the employees, who are you recruiting? How are you bringing them into the recruitment process to come to work at your campus? Do your students see someone that reflects who they are on your campus? Think about that first year experience for employees. How are they learning that they actually are keepers of the culture, and that this culture of inclusion has to be instructed and taught and modeled? You know, how many of those folks are given the kinds of mentors and supports and professional development plans such that you can ensure that everyone recognizes and embraces this culture of inclusion at your campus? What happens in terms of the kind of professional development that your folks get so that they can be their best selves? We're often telling students that they should have a growth mindset, but are we saying to our employees, you too should have a growth mindset? You too can get better at equity and diversity and inclusion if you work hard at it. You too can address the issues of race and racism and bigotry and all of these kinds of things with help and with support and with working at it, so that you're not in the position and posture of being resistant. And then transitioning, how do we make sure that people stay engaged? How do we make sure that our transfer students don't feel like others? How do we make sure that our employees don't feel like others? Not not just new because they're new, but what about your employees of color? How do we make sure that they don't feel that they are the others in the midst? We've got to be intentional about how we create this opportunity. And these are just some of the things that you can do in terms of inclusion by design. And now I'll stop my share.
Thank you, Michael. We had a comment saying they love the emojis, and that was a really great way to illustrate that continuum. And that continuum is so important. And I suspect that those of us in the audience, and just, we know that we have a broad sense of functional areas that are represented in our audience today. We have folks who are probably further along in their equity exploration and commitment, as you've described there. And one of the phrases, Michael, that you used and everybody kind of resonated with was get in where you fit in. So can you three kind of talk about what it means to get into this type of DEI work, such that it fits you now and where you might want to be going?
Well, I can start. Think about that little graph I showed you. Where are you on the graph? You know, are you, when you looked at all those little emojis, which one was you? And if you are truly trying to teach students to have a growth mindset, where do you need to grow? And where does that institution need to grow? And how does that institution impact the community and its need to grow? And so you got to get in where you fit in. If you are not as interculturally as competent as you need to be, well, what are you going to do about it? And don't just wait for your institution to run the professional development program through the Center for Teaching and Learning. What are you going to do to make sure that you have everything you need to be successful? If you are, whatever your field of endeavor, you go to professional development. This is a professional development program. But what other things are you going to do to ensure that you can get in when you fit in?
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo that in many ways, and I would again encourage folks to think about that get in and as you fit in, as I think each of the three of us tried to underscore that this is a process, that it's a journey, and so folks need to think about and be very deliberate and intentional, as to how they can grow, assessing their own personal current state, as well as what they would like as a desired state, and do that with regard to how they reflect upon their program areas, their units, their campus, again, for both what might be unhealthy and ways in which they're not proficient relative to values, to orientation, to behaviors and practices and policies, right? So that there's a current state and there's a projected desired state that folks need to, again, not just plan, but do. And so that they can actually have a paradigmatic kind of shift from where they are to where they need to be.
I call it steps beyond statements. It's great to make
That's right.
statements, but what steps are you going to
Mhm.
take?
Yeah.
And I love all of the people that are all of the Nike and all the different companies that we really want to stand against all this stuff. Great. So tell me the different things that you're going to do so that the commercial you just made looking altruistic actually is now becoming the action steps you're taking to achieve the noble aim you talked about in this.
Right.
Because we do phrases well, we do statements well, we do pictures and program, we do all of that very well. Those kind of things we can be very creative. But in terms of what about your hiring practices? Where are you recruiting students from? How are you actually requiring them to take classes that they don't really need and pay stuff over again? Are you doing the kind of things that actually contribute to the caste system in higher education, which once was law, but now is practice?
Mhm.
And so where I would tag team with you, your steps beyond statements for me is right sizing, right? And so I talk about, folks trying to be right with their rhetoric, but not right sizing it to their realities, right? And so that there's a way in which, we know better, but we don't necessarily hold ourselves accountable to have the disposition and the wherewithal and intentionality to do better.
And I was just going to say accountability, right? The same way that we hold companies and other organizations accountable, we have to hold ourselves accountable, right? And our colleagues accountable. So as you learn and grow, it is up to you to challenge, right? To push, to question, because the status quo stays the status quo because people are not pushing against the system. And now is the time to do that. So the more you learn, you have to share with others, right? Because you will see and hear when you open your ears and eyes, you will see more microaggressions happening that you didn't realize before. You will hear people say things. You will hear students saying things about themselves that they have been indoctrinated to believe to be true, that you then have to challenge for them, right? Because you're their champion. What does that mean? You're their mentor in some capacities. What does that mean? You're going for a more humane and equitable world, right? You do not want to keep the status quo by any means.
So that brings me to a really, I think, important question. When we're in the midst of this work and we've identified those microaggressions and maybe we've identified some of that deficit thinking in ourselves, how can we kind of stop in our tracks, stop with our colleagues and reconcile that in the moment? Like, what is that one technique that in the moment that we can say, stop, reevaluate, let's do something different, just right in that moment?
Conscious people can say, what I hear you saying is,
Yeah.
because then if you don't mean that, clear it up. But before you ever say that again, now you've got an awareness that, okay, I have to be more conscious and careful about my language because what I may say is not necessarily what I mean. At the end of the day, we're going to look at what you do. So be conscious that verbal is great, but we're going to watch your behavior. What I'm saying is that it is important for us to recognize that we all have to police ourselves and do our inner work. We all have to get better, and it can't just be, well, let me call my Black friend and see if it's okay for me to say XYZ. Because what you don't realize that you're now putting your Black friend on is now the person who's going to be the spokesperson for all Black people. Well, then you might have a Black friend that has the same opinion that you do. so you and then you're in a different kind of challenging ecosystem. So I think, but don't be afraid if somebody who's, open to you will say, what I hear you saying is XYZ. Because then you own it because you said it.
Right. So I also wonder too, there are so many amazing resources out there. And if you were to say, cut through all the stuff, every bit of it's important. We're all learners, and in higher ed, we have that collection of knowledge problem, but we don't have that good sense to say, let's stop and process this before we move on to something else. So what would be that one resource that you feel like right now would facilitate these conversations with our students, with our colleagues, so that the next time we walk into, say, an advising appointment, or the next time we're in a leadership meeting, that our conversation's a little bit different? What's that one resource? Not to say it's the only one out there, but like, where can they start? What's your favorite? What's your thing?
Yeah, Janet, you and I talked about a while ago, Equity Talk to Equity Walk, the book by Estella and Tia McNair. And it gives you practical steps, and it sort of meets you where you are and it pushes you, right? And so that's one resource. It's a physical book. I will also say that I often say that this equity work is sort of like going to therapy, right? You will learn things about yourself because you will start to question your beliefs and your assumptions. Embrace that, right? Give yourself some grace, because everybody might not give you grace. So give yourself some grace as you are learning and having difficult conversations with yourself and with others, right? We also know that, this is not answering your question, but we also know that blaming and shaming people will not move them.
Mm-mm.
So you have to be able to, if you say something wrong, if someone says something wrong by you, you can't, tell them, oh my God, and throw a fit about it. You do have to call them to the carpet on it. But you cannot blame or shame them, because they will put up a wall.
And that's why inquiry is important. Just simply ask the question, because at the end of the day, don't presume don't automatically presume harmful behavior. Just, it could be ignorance, but by asking the question, you'll know where you're coming from, and that'll give them a chance to reflect. I think from my perspective, there's a bunch of really great equity guides on the National Center for Inquiry and Improvement on all of these different topics. I wrote one of the guides as well, and Ebony has been a part of these conversations as well, that these, a lot of different topics, you can get PowerPoint discussion guides. They're using these a lot of these folks are using this in California with the guided pathways work, but those equity guides are really, really helpful. PowerPoint discussion guides, all of that, and an article featured by practitioners, primarily from the equity perspective, and it's not just practitioners in higher education, so in other sectors as well. So I think sometimes we get so caught up in our folks having a conversation, and we don't realize that there's a lot of people having really important conversations, and you don't just have to look at this discussion from a higher ed lens.
Right.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
I
I guess.
want to go ahead, Ebony, to kind of close this out, if you don't mind.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, when Francesca talked about this being like therapy, the thing about counseling is it works best when there's candor, right? When you strip down, remove the veneer, lift the veil, and speak truth, right? And you got to call a thing. And so you're only able to move the needle on your own development, let alone, helping to address what again have been some pervasive inequities, particularly as we look at it, how they impact racialized minorities most adversely. If you are going to keep it real and keep it 100, you can't have a foot in two different areas where you got one foot in and one foot out of, I'm committed to diversity. I want to ensure equity. Oh, why y'all talking about race again? And so you can't just, bury your head, so to speak. So yeah, it's only as cathartic as you are, wanting to come with candor and do the work.
Excellent. Couldn't have asked for better advice. I know there were quite a few questions in the chat that maybe we didn't get to. I can assure you that we will follow up on these, and we'll find a way to publish them either as part of the conference or more than likely a little bit afterwards. So just know that we had so many good things to cover today. Didn't get to all of them, but plenty of material to sit with, to reflect upon, and most importantly, do something with. So thank you very much to our esteemed panel for being with us today. great lessons and lots of work ahead of us. So glad to know we're all in this together. Thank you.
Great to see everybody.
You too, thanks.
Thank you.